There's a brand new paper, you guys, coming out in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology that vindicates saturated fat and says we need to change food recommendations based on this. On today's Jimmy Rants, click on that little box down there in the corner. It'll take you straight to the IGTV so you can watch this full episode. JimmyRants.com is the website, and as always, you can engage live in the content. You gotta go follow me though. I'm over on Instagram. I am at Living Low Carb Man, LIVINLOWCARBMAN. Once you're there, engage live, enjoy the show. We're here Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern time, so be there, be square. We also simulcast over here on my Facebook page with great people like Nancy just popped in. Thanks for being here today, you guys. And also over on my YouTube stream. Appreciate you guys watching as well. If you missed the live, you can watch it on replay over at IGTV right here on Instagram. We also throw the past episodes up over on YouTube. Just type in a keyword Jimmy Rants, you will find the show. And then finally, we do have an official website for Jimmy Rants. It's JimmyRants.com. Once you're there, you can see all the past episodes. And if you get value out of what I share here today, I try to give you good information on a wide variety of subjects. If you get value out of this show, you can show value back to me by clicking on that Patreon link, and really any donation of any amount would be greatly appreciated. We have no sponsors on Jimmy Rants. The only thing I'm sponsoring is you, and giving you good information. So if you feel like you get value, please give value back to me so I can keep this show going. Okay, guys, today we have some really, really good news. And I've been telling you for a little while that behind the scenes in the research world, there is a movement that has been going on for many years now that's trying to explain that saturated fat is not this great boogeyman that it's been made out to be. So many people, if you walk down the street and you ask people, hey, is saturated fat healthy or unhealthy? So many people still believe, erroneously so, that saturated fat is somehow harmful to their health. And the reason they believe that is we've been told that again and again and again so many times over the years that people just believe it's absolutely true. The problem is once they started doing research on saturated fat, once they started actually examining what research has been out there, they didn't find any correlation whatsoever between saturated fat and higher cholesterol and higher chances of heart disease and heart attacks and da-da-da-da-da. They didn't find any of that. And yet the belief is still there. So a group of very prestigious medical professionals and researchers got together and decided to write this thing called Saturated Fats and Health, a reassessment and proposal for food-based recommendations. It's a Journal of the American College of Cardiology state-of-the-art review. So this is hot off the press, you guys. I remember when I woke up this morning and I saw all those people writing about this within the keto space, I was like, okay, I got to get my hands on that. So I reached out to my friend Eric Westman, who is a researcher in the keto space, and he obviously had a copy of it, so he sent it to me so I can share it with you guys here today on Jimmy Rants. But guys, this is big, and we got some big names in here. Arne Astrup, I'm trying to think of the names that you would recognize. James O'Hill, who's a PhD. Jeff Volek is also on this list, and then Ronald Krauss. So these are all people that you would probably recognize, and they have put their names on this research. And basically what they did was they took a lot of the various research papers that are out there, and they did what's called a meta-analysis, where they took a look at all these studies and they said, based on what we're looking at in all these studies, here are some conclusions we can make about what they were looking at. And in this specific paper, they were looking at saturated fat and its impact on your health, because you still ask grandma, grandpa, even mom and dad about saturated fat, and they're gonna be like, yeah, it's gonna clog your arteries. And how many of us have gone over to family's house, you open the refrigerator and you see, I can't believe it's not butter, and you don't see real butter. And there's a reason for that. They still believe saturated fat is harmful. So let's get into the nitty gritty. This is a long paper, so I'm gonna try not to get too deep into the weeds of it, but I do want to go over a lot of what they wrote here. Introduction. Lowering the consumption of saturated fat has been the central theme of the U.S. dietary guidelines and recommendations since the late 1970s. Since 1980, it's been recommended saturated fatty acids be limited to less than 10% of your total calories as a means of reducing your cardiovascular risk. In 2018, the USDA and Health and Human Services asked for public comment in response to the following question: what is the relationship between saturated fat, types and amounts, and the risk of CVD, cardiovascular disease, in adults? This review was aiming to address this important question by examining available evidence on the effects of saturated fat on health outcomes, risk factors, and potential mechanisms underlying cardiovascular and metabolic outcomes, which will have implications for the 2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. So, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, the advisory committee, wanted to know, hey, is there any relationship between these two? And so they put out the call a couple years ago, hey, if you've got evidence that shows there's a relationship, give it to us. If you've got evidence that shows there's not a relationship, give it to us. So they were openly asking for research that either proved it did or did not cause heart disease to have saturated fat. So the relationship between dietary saturated fat and heart disease has been studied in more than 75,000 people cumulatively across all the studies and summarized in a number of systematic reviews of the observational studies as well as RCTs, randomized controlled trials. Some meta-analyses found no evidence that a reduction in saturated fat consumption would reduce CVD incidence or mortality. In other words, you die. Whereas others report a significant, albeit mild, beneficial effect of consuming saturated fat. Therefore, the basis for consistently recommending a diet low in saturated fat is unclear. So the purpose of this review here today is to critically evaluate the health effects of dietary saturated fatty acids and to propose an evidence-based recommendation for a healthy intake of different SFA food sources. Okay, if you just joined us, you guys, I am reading from what is the biggest story in keto here today. There is a brand new reassessment and review of all the various studies, and they did a meta-analysis looking at saturated fat and its impact on your health. This is all over the keto space today, and this is going to be published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology any day now. But I got my grubby hands on it and thought I would share it with you guys here today on Jimmy Rants. So, saturated fats comprise a heterogeneous group of fatty acids that contain only carbon and carbon, blah, blah, blah. We don't need to get in all the scientific jargon. Let's keep going and see. Basically, they just describe the scientific process of what a saturated fat is, how it works through the body. Don't think we need to go into all that. Okay, here's a good one. In the discussions of foods, it is useful to distinguish between fat and fatty acids. Saturated fat can be defined as foods that are primarily lipid and solid at temperatures at which they are customarily stored and consumed. Things like butter and butter fat, dairy-derived fats contained in cheese, animal fats like tallow and lard, and plant oils like cocoa butter, chocolate, coconut oil, palm, and palm kernel oils. These fats are solid because they are comprised of mostly saturated fatty acids, where the term saturated designates a specific chemical structure of fatty acids, specifically a reduced ability to chemically react with I2 or H2. So the major saturated fatty acids in most human diets is stearic, palmitic, myristic, and lauric acids. Foods from which saturated fats can be derived are things like full-fat dairy, yogurt, and cheese, and usually said to contain saturated fats, although they contain saturated fatty acids, which are chemically defined structures, whereas saturated fats are complex chemical mixtures of all the saturated fatty acids. That's getting a little bit in the weeds, but the point is they have saturated fatty acids in them, which is what they're trying to establish here. And then, okay, if they have them in them, are they having any negative effect on your health? All right, so the most recent large and diverse study addressing this question of whether saturated fats have a negative effect on your health, specifically cardiovascular disease, is this thing called the PURE study, Prospective Urban Rural Epidemiological Study. They looked at 135,000 people, mostly with CVD from 18 different countries, 5 different continents. 80% of them are low and middle income countries. Increased consumption of all types of fat, which includes saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated, was associated with a lower risk of death and a neutral association with CVD. Did you get that? The PURE study found, yeah, they had fat, but they had a lower risk of death. And nothing changed about cardiovascular risk. So if saturated fat is somehow the enemy in heart disease, wouldn't we want to see, or wouldn't we think that we would expect to see a whole bunch of heart disease in these countries where they're eating saturated fat? You would think. By contrast, a diet high in carbohydrate was associated with the highest risk of death, but not with the risk of CVD. This study also demonstrated that individuals in the quintile with the highest intake of saturated fat, which was about 14% of their calories, had the lowest risk of stroke, and that is consistent with other meta-analyses of various studies. Furthermore, in a newly published study of nearly 200,000 participants from the UK Biobank, who were followed up for nearly 11 years, there was no evidence saturated fat was associated with any kind of incidence of CVD. In contrast, the substitution of polyunsaturated fat for saturated fat was associated with a higher risk of CVD. And this is important because in the mainstream of recommendations of what they tell people to do, cut your saturated fat and replace it with vegetable oils. And what is the primary fat found in vegetable oils, seed oils? Polyunsaturated fats. While there was also a positive relation of saturated fat intake with all-cause mortality, this became significant only with intakes well above the average consumption. In other words, the more saturated fat you ate, the less likely you were to die. Now that runs counter directly to the message we've been given. People are scared half to death to eat saturated fat simply because they think the more saturated fat they eat, they're clogging their arteries and they're going to get a heart attack. But what they're saying in this paper is they've looked at all the various studies that are out there, and there's no evidence to show that the higher amount of saturated fat that you consume, that you're increasing any kind of disease whatsoever or your risk of dying from it. Notably, the diet with the lowest hazard ratio for all-cause mortality comprised of high fiber, which was defined as 10 to 30 grams a day, protein from 14 to 30% a day, monounsaturated fat 10 to 25%, and moderate polyunsaturated fat 5 to almost 7% with minimal starch intake. For dietary carbohydrate, as shown in the PURE study, higher consumption mainly from starchy carbs and sugar was associated with a much higher risk of CVD and mortality. So in other words, the connection to heart disease and dying from some kind of a heart-related event is coming from carbohydrates. And this is the thing that just gets me. The basis of the dietary guidelines for Americans is still very heavily carbohydrate. And so if we're going to look at what the real causes of heart disease are, we need to take the focus off of saturated fat because there's a whole lot of nut in there. But if you want to take a look at what evidence is showing, and what it is showing is starch and sugar are contributing directly to heart disease and people dying from it. And that's a fact that's not nearly underscored enough, and you're not hearing anything about it in the mainstream. In the context of contemporary diets, therefore, these observations would suggest there is little need to further limit the intake of total or saturated fat for most people, By contrast, restricting carbohydrate, particularly refined carbohydrate, may be much more relevant today for decreasing the risk of mortality, especially those who have insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, which I would argue is probably 70 to 80% of the population has some level of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. Most randomized trials of nutrient intake and clinical events have been relatively small in size. Those that comprise the basis of dietary recommendations to limit saturated fat were conducted 40 to 50 years ago. Now get this. All the studies that looked at limiting saturated fat, they happened in the 1980s, 70s and 80s. Since then, crickets. It's almost as if they said, okay, science has settled this question and we are no longer going to question it whatsoever. But how many people still believe saturated fat is somehow causing heart disease? A lot. The vast majority. And if you reveal to them, you know that research was done like 40 or 50 years ago, and today we have a lot of evidence that shows the exact opposite, that the more saturated fat you eat, the less heart disease you have. Would that surprise you? And it would. It would surprise a lot of people. By far, the largest contemporary study of diet is the Women's Health Initiative. It had nearly 49,000 women, which demonstrated that risk for heart attack and stroke was unaffected after 8 years of low-fat diet in which saturated fat was less than 10% of their total energy intake. In other words, it didn't make them healthier to cut their saturated fat. It did not. The Predimed study compared a standard low-fat diet to a Mediterranean diet supplemented with nuts and olive oil. Despite an increase in total fat intake by 4.5% of total energy, major cardiovascular events and death were significantly reduced compared to the control group. So they added in more fat, and cardiovascular events and death from it reduced. Huge. It turns everything upside down about what we've always believed about fat and its supposed negative effects on our health. Furthermore, in the 6 most recent systematic reviews and meta-analyses of randomized trials, results showed that replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat had no significant effect on your coronary outcomes or on total mortality. And yet that's exactly what they're telling us to do. I hear on the radio from time to time this commercial from the American Heart Association. And they say, oh, we need to reduce your consumption of the bad fats like saturated fats and replace them with a healthy oil like vegetable oil and canola oil if you want to be heart healthy. And yet what they're demonstrating in this paper here is that's not true at all. You don't get a benefit. It doesn't improve you whatsoever. And it should beg the question, if there's no improvement when you switch out your saturated fats for polyunsaturated fats, if there's no benefit seen, there's no change happening at all, could it be that it's not the saturated fat after all? Why is this not obvious? Why is this still controversial in any way to say the saturated fat is not the grand boogeyman that it's been made out to be? It's not. Even if these analyses were to be challenged, for example, based on the criteria for study selection or any other lines of evidence, an important possibility to consider is that an apparently lower risk of CVD with substitution of saturated fatty acids by polyunsaturated fatty acids could be attributed to a possible beneficial effect that comes from PUFAs, the polyunsaturated fats, and not necessarily that there was an adverse effect of the saturated fat. So they want to say that, well, saturated fat we know harms you, and so switching it out for a better option is always going to be better. And I'm going, okay, but what if no change happens when you change to that better? What if there is no deleterious effect of doing that switch? Did you need to make the switch is the question. Now, if your outcomes became far better after making the switch, then they would have a leg to stand on. But that's not what happened. There is therefore a large body of information that raises questions regarding conventional beliefs about saturated fatty acids and clinical outcomes. Taken together, the evidence from both cohort studies as well as randomized trials do not support the assertion that further restriction of dietary saturated fat will reduce any clinical events. So they go into the various ways that saturated fats are not increasing cardiovascular event, even though they might have some effects on intermediary things like LDL cholesterol. So looking at LDL, it's been traditionally the risk marker used to assess CVD, cardiovascular disease, and to monitor the effects of lifestyle and pharmaceutical interventions. But the problem is LDL is still not very reliable as a marker. And I've talked about this many times on Jimmy Rants. When you get a standard lipid panel, an LDL-C is merely calculated estimated number. It's not really telling you a whole lot about anything. It's when you kind of get the breakdown of that LDL into the various particles and what the size of those particles are. That's the thing that matters the most. And they go through all the different studies that are out there. I've talked about them so often. I think we'll move on. But the main point is, from an LDL perspective, it's a whole lot of nothing there. There's no association that lower levels of LDL cholesterol are somehow more protective of you than higher levels of LDL. And I still have people write to me just about every day. I just got one yesterday here on Instagram in a direct message. The person said, "Oh, my wife is very concerned, and here's her numbers." And she had like a 232 total cholesterol. Her LDL was like 140 something. And of course, on the standard lipid panel, it says high. So that freaks people out. Oh, it's high. Yeah, it's high on the scale that they're looking at. But the scale that they're looking at is flawed. And so people still freak out about this. But LDL is a whole lot of nothing when it comes to your risk of cardiovascular disease. They also talk about the modulation of the health effects of saturated fat by dietary carbohydrate intake and insulin resistance, which we've talked about this quite a bit lately too. Insulin resistance states like metabolic syndrome, prediabetes, type 2 diabetes affects well over 100 million people in the US alone. Insulin resistance manifests functionally as carbohydrate intolerance. Listen to that, guys. When you have insulin resistance, you have carbohydrate intolerance, meaning you can't handle a lot of carbs. This is why a lot of us, a low-carb ketogenic diet tends to work pretty well in helping us control insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, prediabetes. Insulin-resistant lean subjects demonstrate impaired skeletal muscle glucose oxidation, increased hepatic de novo lipogenesis, and atherogenic dyslipidemia after a high-carb meal. In other words, if you're insulin sensitive, you're able to handle those carbohydrates. But if you're insulin resistant, at the very muscular level, at the very metabolic level, you can't handle a high-carb meal without it having negative effects. Therefore, an individual with insulin resistance has a higher propensity to convert that carbohydrate over into fat, which will further exacerbate the insulin resistance. This is the thing. Once you get insulin resistance and your body's fighting against you, and then you store in more body fat, guess what happens then? You become more insulin resistant. So then the next time you eat a high-carb meal again, and it adds the fat, and more fat adds to more insulin resistance. It's a ruthless cycle. It's why so many people have a hard time, once you get body fat, getting rid of it, because the body's constantly fighting you. This is where carbohydrate restriction can help. It's not the only thing that helps, but it's definitely a major component. In addition to the standard risk factors like high triglycerides, low HDL, central body fat in the body, hypertension, hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, this phenotype also includes increasing circulating levels of saturated fat and lipogenic fatty acids. So I remember Dr. Volek, who is a part of this review that I'm looking at right now, he did a study many years ago, I want to say like 2008, 2009, and I remember sitting in a conference when he was revealing this study, and he said those who consume the highest amounts of saturated fat in their diet actually had the lowest amount of circulating blood fats, circulating blood saturated fat. And that seems so counterintuitive. You would think if you ate more saturated fat, that more of that saturated fat would be in your blood, but that's not what happens at all. The saturated fat in the blood actually comes from the consumption of carbohydrate. So when you consume especially refined carbohydrates, but really any carbohydrate that would turn to sugar in the body, that is what leads to a higher level of saturated fats in the blood. Think triglycerides. And that is what is going to be the increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So you see, it's not the saturated fat at all. It's the triglycerides, which comes from carbs. It is important to distinguish between dietary saturated fat and circulating saturated fat. And he goes into that study that I just described for you guys. All right, so let's keep going here. If you joined us late, yes, there is a brand new assessment. They're reassessing food-based recommendations for saturated fat and health. This is a review of a paper that's about to come out in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. I have the hot off the presses scoop for you guys here today. Saturated Fats and Health, a reassessment and proposal for food-based recommendations, a state-of-the-art review, and it's got a lot of the superstars in the world of research looking at this, and I wanted to bring this to you guys sooner than later. I had a totally another topic I was going to talk about on Jimmy Rants today, but this was too big for me not to bring it to you right now. All right, so they talk about tailoring dietary saturated fat intake to your cardiometabolic risk. Despite many decades of nutrition research in humans and animal models, the scientific community has not yet reached a consensus on what the one diet is. They've tried low fat, it failed. They tried Mediterranean, it failed. And they haven't been able to achieve an optimal metabolic health for everyone on any one given diet. The highly heterogeneous outcomes of dietary intervention studies suggest that some individuals have better outcomes for specific diets than others. And you guys have heard me talk about this many times. Bioindividuality. We are all different. It's ludicrous to think that one singular diet is going to work for every single person. What if somebody's dripping wet 80 pounds? Do they need to eat the same diet as someone who weighs 500 pounds? I don't think so. So it makes total sense that you would have different diets for different people tailored to them individually. Therefore, the objective should be to match people with their individual best diet. And conversely, as discussed above, the once apparent tight link between dietary saturated fat and CVD appears to be loosening as a result of mounting evidence that casts doubt on that established belief. And I'll remind you, the last major studies looking at any kind of association between saturated fat intake and cardiovascular disease took place 40 to 50 years ago. I would think any scientist worth his salt that still believes in that hypothesis needs to be trying to replicate those studies right now. And you should be asking yourself, why haven't they tried to replicate those studies? If they found studies that showed an association between those two, why wouldn't they want to replicate them to prove all us low-carb keto people are crazy? The reason is they have the dietary guidelines in place. That belief is firmly established. Why cast any doubt on that belief whatsoever? And now, in the face of contrarian support and evidence, they don't want to believe it. Well, we just know what we believe is true. Okay, but I have evidence to the contrary. I think all these researchers on this paper here need to say, okay, research community, if you think what we've done here is wrong, then we challenge you to go out and do the studies. And I would even say, help pay for those studies. Let's see what they do. And a lot of these low-carb researchers, I know when they've done low-fat versus low-carb types of research, they don't show good outcomes for the low saturated fat end of things. They don't. They show very poor outcomes. But they're biased. Let's see somebody like Kevin Hall step up and try to do a legit study on this. Some research over the last 2 decades has shifted towards the identification of genetic factors underlying the inter-individual differences in response to dietary fats. This is things like ApoE genotype. I've talked about that many times. I'm a 3-3, but if you have a 4, you have to adjust your saturated fat intake. If you have a 2, same thing. It's a little tricky, but this just adds more of an underscoring of it being highly individualized. The information emerging from these studies suggests gene variants may modulate the relationship between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. In some cases, dietary saturated fats enhance the association, predisposing to increased CVD risk. This has been shown with that ApoE gene, is what they're saying here. Specifically, carriers of the less common ApoE4 allele have reportedly shown greater fasting plasma lipid response to saturated fat than non-ApoE4 carriers, as well as similar findings reported in the postprandial state after they're done eating. These gene by diet interactions have been demonstrated for other CVD risk factors as well, such as obesity, on and on and on. All right, let's keep going here. From single nutrients to whole foods, lessons from ancestral diets, food processing, and the food matrix. The overall health effects of fats and oils depends on the content of saturated fatty acids and unsaturated fatty acids, but is not merely the sum of the effects of the individual lipid components. Rather, it depends on the interacting effects from naturally occurring components and from unhealthy compounds used and introduced during processing. These compounds are often overlooked in the assessment of the health effects of oils and fats, and the risk of this is illustrated by the trans fat story. The substitution of traditional dairy fats with vegetable oils has a long history, dating back to at least the 1870s, and has driven the saturated versus unsaturated fat debate ever since. By the 1950s, the major component of 20th century vegetable oils was polyunsaturated linoleic acid, widely recognized to decrease plasma cholesterol concentrations, and thus they surmised it had a favorable effect on atherosclerosis over saturated fat, which they said raises cholesterol. But despite the high content of saturated fat, dairy fat has never been shown to promote atherogenesis. The ability of adult humans to digest sugar unique to milk like lactose evolved separately numerous times, demonstrating unequivocally that the ancestors of many modern humans required continuous dairy consumption for survival to reproductive age. So he goes on to kind of show the benefits of how animal-based dairy products have been essential in our survival, and the saturated fat content of them helped. The saturated fat of the meat of those species was likely a major contributor to human diets, along with fruit oils like olive, avocado, palm. All of them are low in polyunsaturated fats, and palm oil is very high in saturated fat. Coconut fat would have been the only abundant lipid-rich seed, and it is also high in saturated fat. Seed oil consumption, which now dominates the food supply, would have been negligible back then, and until the advent of industrialized fat extraction in recent centuries. These historical facts demonstrate saturated fats were an abundant key part of our human diet. And this is what's lost in this conversation. We need to be cutting our saturated fat. And I'm going, okay, what did they do, 100 years ago? 150 years ago? 500 years ago? How are they eating? And go back to hunter-gatherer times from an ancestral standpoint. Do you think when they killed the animal that they were worried about the saturated fat content clogging their arteries and giving them heart disease? I think not. They ate the food. It was delicious. It was nutritious. It gave them satiety. They got all these benefits. And oh yeah, by the way, they had no heart disease. We didn't start having major heart disease happening in America until we started introducing processed carbohydrates to the food supply. That's when all you know what broke loose and heart disease became a thing. But nobody wants to look at the historical aspect of how saturated fats helped us get to where we are today. If it weren't for saturated fats, the human species would not have survived. By the 1970s, many experimental studies in animal models were conducted with dietary coconut oil of unspecified origin, which reliably caused dramatic increases in blood cholesterol in rodents. This was taken as evidence that saturated fats are inherently atherogenic. However, coconut oils of the era were unusually highly processed, often fully hydrogenated. Recent gentle preparation methods yield virgin coconut oils that do not raise your LDL compared to customary diets. They have similar effects compared to olive oil in humans. Studies in rodents demonstrate that while highly processed, refined, bleached, deodorized coconut oil will raise your serum cholesterol, virgin coconut oil does not. So those of you that get coconut oil in your diet, get virgin coconut oil, and it has shown to be no effect on your LDL cholesterol. In the last decade, the concept of processed contaminants generated from high temperature treatments of oils in the presence of trace metals has come to the forefront. The triglyceride derivatives glycidyl and monochloropropanoidal esters are common contaminants well studied for their carcinogenic properties. Recently, the metabolic effects of virgin coconut oil and oil processing on human liver cells were investigated. A method was developed to enable cells to take up the whole oil, including the contaminants, and the oil passed through successive stages of processing, starting with virgin oil, then subjected to free fatty acid removal, bleaching, deodorization. With all this increase in processing, cellular cholesterol increased, and they talk about that. So in other words, try to stay away from those heavily processed ones and stick with the virgin ones. Human studies that assume all foods that are high in saturated fats are similarly atherogenic come in many cases from an era prior to the recognition of these contaminants. So this is an important part of this discussion, because if they're going to lump in all saturated fats as one thing, they're not. And you have to look at the kinds. This is why getting more quality saturated fats is important. This is why I'm a big fan of like grass-fed butter. This is why I'm a big fan of virgin coconut oil. If you're going to use coconut oil, beef tallow from quality animals, lard from pastured pigs. You're gonna want to try to have the highest quality, because quality matters in this discussion of saturated fat. All right, let's see what else they have in here. All right, so they talk about the various health effects of differing food sources of saturated fat. Dairy is the major source of saturated fatty acids in most people's diets, and major dietary guidelines recommend low-fat or fat-free versions to limit the saturated fat. However, food-based meta-analyses consistently finds that cheese and yogurt intakes are inversely associated with CVD risk. In other words, you eat it and you have a lower CVD risk. Whole fat dairy may also be protective against type 2 diabetes. Using circulating biomarkers of dairy intake, an inverse association with CHD was found, whereas for other biomarkers, a neutral association was found with total mortality. Moreover, a pooled individual level of nearly 65,000 participants across international cohorts found that plasma and tissue levels of odd-chain saturated fatty acids and natural ruminant trans fatty acids, in other words, the trans fats naturally found in meat, all of which reflect dairy fat consumption, were associated with a lower risk of diabetes. Cheese and yogurt consist of complex food matrices. Major components include fatty acids, protein like whey and casein, minerals like calcium, magnesium, and phosphate, sodium, and phospholipid components of milk fat. Yogurt and cheese also have probiotics, bacterially produced bioactive peptides, short-chain fatty acids, and vitamins like vitamin K2. The complete matrix and components of dairy may explain why the effect of dairy food consumption cannot be explained on cardiovascular risk and predicted in its content in saturated fats. This is an important part of this conversation, guys. When we look at these foods, we assume people see meat, for example, and all they see is protein, fat, and they assume all that's in it is protein and fat. But there's so many good micronutrients that come in it, and that's what they're saying in this paper. With the milk and the dairy types of products, there's so many extra things in there that we're not giving credence to. And those extra things are probably providing the benefit, which makes them far healthier for you than they ever imagined. If you only look at dairy products as saturated fat and you're missing things like K2, you're missing minerals like calcium, magnesium, phosphate, you're missing key proteins like whey and casein, you're missing all these elements that go into dairy products, of course you're going to think that they're higher risk. And of course you're going to have a blind eye to what's going on. But this is why we have to continually remind people things like dairy are not just saturated fat. Things like meat are not just protein and saturated fat. They're not. What about eggs? Eggs can be a significant contributor to your total saturated fat intake. In fact, I had 8 eggs for breakfast today, cooked in grass-fed butter. Eggs are also nutrient dense, providing important nutrients that are not widely available in other foods. Well-designed prospective population-based studies have provided conflicting evidence on egg consumption and CVD risk, but a number of meta-analyses have found that the higher egg consumption that you have, the lower risk of CHD, and may be associated with even a lower risk of stroke. Randomized controlled trials have found neutral or beneficial effects on all the cardiometabolic risk markers in people with diabetes and pre-diabetes. All right, let's keep looking here. All right, so research gaps and directions. So we're getting close to the end, and I definitely want to see what you guys have to say. The dietary recommendation to reduce saturated fatty acids without considering specific fatty acids and food sources is not aligned with the current evidence base. As such, it may distract from other more effective food-based recommendations, may also cause a reduction in the intake of things that are nutrient-dense like eggs, dairy, and unprocessed meats. They may also help decrease the risk of CVD, type 2 diabetes, and other non-communicable diseases, but also malnutrition, deficiency diseases, and frailty, and particularly those who are in the at-risk groups. Furthermore, based on several decades of experience, a focus on total saturated fat has had the unintended effect of misleadingly guiding governments, consumers, and industry towards food laws on saturated fat, but not looking at refined starches and sugars. All guidelines should consider the types of fatty acids, the diversity of the foods containing saturated fatty acids, which may possess harmful, neutral, even beneficial effects in relation to their health outcomes. We strongly recommend that we get a more food-based translation of how to achieve a healthy diet and reconsidering the guidelines on the reduction of total saturated fat. Indeed, a focus on gently processed foods is more likely to emerge as a key factor until more is known about the health effects of specific processing contaminants, so those levels can be minimized. So in conclusion, in this paper, you guys, the long-standing bias against foods containing saturated fat should be replaced with a view towards recommending diets consisting of healthy foods. Translation, real foods. What steps could we do to shift this bias? We suggest that we enhance the public's understanding that many foods, including whole-fat dairy, can play an important role in meeting dietary and nutritional recommendations that are rich in saturated fat. We need to make the public aware that low carbohydrate diets high in saturated fat, which are popular for managing body weight, may also improve metabolic disease endpoints in some people. We also need to emphasize the health effects of dietary carbohydrate, just like those of saturated fat, depends on the amount, the type, and the quality of the carbohydrate, the food source, and the degree of processing. Number 3, shift focus from the current paradigm that emphasizes saturated fat content of foods as a key for health to one that centers on specific traditional foods so that nutritionists, dietitians, and the public can easily identify healthful sources of saturated fat. And then finally, number 4, encourage committees in charge of making macronutrient-based recommendations, like the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, to translate those recommendations into appropriate, culturally sensitive dietary patterns tailored to different populations. So guys, what do you think about this? And they got some conclusions here. The U.S. Dietary Guidelines recommend the restriction of saturated fatty acid to less than 10% as a means of reducing cardiovascular disease. Different saturated fatty acids have different biological effects. Several foods rich in saturated fat, like whole fat dairy, dark chocolate, and unprocessed meats, do not have any association with an increase in diabetes or cardiovascular disease. And there is no robust evidence that current population-wide arbitrary upper limits on saturated fat consumption, which the USDA dietary guidelines for 2020 is recommending less than 10% of your total calories, will prevent cardiovascular disease or reduce mortality. So this bad boy is about to get published in a very major journal, the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. This is one of the big boys when it comes to cardiovascular health and research and papers, meta-analyses in this case, that look at this subject. And this is huge, guys. Like, this is going to get out there. And how they ignore this, how they ignore blatant, like there is a ton of like all-stars on this paper of people in the research world that are like, enough is enough. Let's stop fooling people into thinking that somehow saturated fat is harming their health when we have evidence that shows otherwise. And we have evidence that shows, okay, the real culprit in heart disease is not saturated fat, it's carbohydrate, specifically sugars and starches, and specifically the refined forms of those. A day of reckoning is coming, you guys, and maybe this is what helps bring that about. But I definitely want to see what you guys have to say. So welcome in. We're going to go to Instagram first, then over to Facebook, finally to YouTube. Thank you all for being here today. JimmyRants.com is the website. See what you have to say about this one. What are you reading from? Giardia says. So this is from an unpublished paper. It's about to be published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. It's called Saturated Fats and Health, a Reassessment and Proposal for Food-Based Recommendations, a State-of-the-Art Review. So it's about to be released. I have connections in this space, and I got one of my connections to print off this pre-proof copy. But it's going to get out there very soon. And when it does, guys, watch how the media tries to spin this. That's going to be the fun part. It's one reason I wanted to do this Jimmy Rants sooner than later, because I wanted you guys to have this and the information about it. And then when you see all the you-know-what happening out there, you'll know what's going on. Finally caught alive. Well, welcome, Healthy Mission. I'm glad you're here today. Miracle of Keto says, my teenage daughter, I have two of them, just told me that they had a conversation and decided I was right about keto since I hadn't died of a heart attack yet. Oh my gosh. A little morbid your teenagers are, but I guess that's teenagers, right? Rachel says, I hope this is actually taken into consideration for the dietary guidelines in 2020. Unfortunately, Rachel, I don't think so. I mean, we're in late June, and they're supposed to come out with their preliminary findings sometime in July. And they already, as I've done a couple of Jimmy Rants already this year, they've already said, oh, we're not looking at the low carb research on saturated fat and low carb diets because and this is what they said, well, we're not trying to treat any kind of disease. So any kind of study that looks at a specific disease like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, they're dismissing that research, saying that it's not relevant. And I'm thinking, okay, what is the point of the dietary guidelines but to show you how to eat so you don't get diseased? So if we show that a diet helps improve disease, how can it not be anything but a preventative for the said disease that it actually improved? So I think they're doing a little bit of spin. But I'm not hopeful for 2020, Rachel, unfortunately, that they're going to do anything with this. But I think by 2025, there will be such a groundswell of WTF going on that they won't have any choice but to shift away from this low-fat nonsense. All right, guys. Thank you, Instagram. Now let me pop over here to my Facebook page, see what you guys have to say. What's up, guys? All right. Any comments on this one? Kay says this is good news. It is good news, and I hope we celebrate that there's good movement in a right direction. I still think we have a long way to go to actually make change happen, but this is a good start. Kira says, how long will it take to reverse the course and for people to believe this good news about saturated fat being good? Oh, I've been asking that question, Kira, since I've been online. Ever since I started blogging in 2005, podcasting 2006, I have literally asked that question. And back then I said, you know what? I think by the time 2025, 2030, I can't imagine that we wouldn't have this knowledge enough to the point that it becomes mainstream policy. I think what's going to happen is you're going to have doctors, dietitians, health officials, all of these people get on board that says, okay, guys, I know we've been telling you all these years that saturated fat is harming your health and da-da-da. We were wrong. I think it's just going to be one of those mea culpas. The problem is you dig in your heels when you think you're right about something. And there's a segment of those people I just listed off that will never admit that they were wrong. Plus, let's not forget, there is a deep-seated fear that if they reverse course and say saturated fat is not a nutrient of concern, it's not harmful, blah, 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 there will be people who will file class action lawsuits that say, oh, well, I obediently followed your orders to cut my saturated fat, and my grandfather died because he cut his saturated fat. He died of da-da-da-da-da. And they're fearful of that, you guys. This is what paralyzes us. This is what makes this so hard to make the change happen is they don't want to change because they don't want to be the ones found culpable in why so many people got sick. So the optimistic side of me says 2025 to 2030. The realist says, you know what, they're going to have a hard time because they do fear that outcry from the public. All right, thank you, Facebook. Now let's pop over to my YouTube, see if there's any comments over here. Deborah says, hello, hello. Johanna, hello from Finland. Thanks for watching from Finland today. Shirley says, it's nice to see a little sense in this world of nutrition. Yes. There's still a few people out there that are speaking truth. And truth be told, this kind of thing, guys, is going to have so much attack against it. You watch. When this hits the mainstream, if they cover it at all, I'm a little dubious whether they're going to actually cover this story. Because this story does not look good for the narrative that saturated fat is the reason for all the woes in your health. And I don't know if they want to give any credence to this whatsoever. Now, they may demonstrate it and say, oh, look at these low-carb, crazy people trying to convince you to eat saturated fat when we know it's going to clog your arteries and give you heart disease and blah, 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 blah. So they might try to use it in a mocking way to report on it. But let's see. Let's see what happens. You can say you heard it here first on Jimmy Rants. Plant-based diet is being promoted all around us, says Kira. I hate seeing the Beyond Burgers on the shelf. Ugh. And they put it near the grass-fed, grass-finished beef like it's the same class of food. Yeah, they're trying desperately to legitimize that. It's funny because I saw the same thing the other day when I was in a grocery store. I saw an end cap that had burgers, and so you had all these like real burgers. And then you saw the Beyond Meat burgers, and I'm going, I'll be beyond this aisle here in a second because there's no way I would ever eat that stuff. All right, let's see if there's any other comments here on Instagram, and I do not see any. So guys, this is good news. We need to celebrate when we see good things happening out there in the mainstream, and this is about to hit it big, you guys. The Journal of the American College of Cardiology is one of the most prestigious journals in the medical research realm. And this got through peer review, this got through everything. And it's a group of very highly respectable MDs and PhDs that have been looking at dietary patterns for a very long time, cumulatively between all of them. And we need to just highlight this. So share this video everywhere you can so that people know there is good things happening behind the scenes when it comes to saturated fat. That's it for this episode of Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com is the website. As always, you can engage live in the content. We're right here on Instagram at Livin' Low Carb Man, LivinLowCarbMan. We go live Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Lena says there might not be such a demand for cardiologists then. Oh, talking about, shifting over to this. Well, that's good. I don't think cardiology needs to be a big thing. Cardiology became this big business because open heart surgeries and all these procedures are making a lot of cardiologists a lot of money. I don't think it matters if we lose cardiologists. Shift into something else that's preventative. Help people not get heart disease. Help people not have to have procedures that a cardiologist would be needed for. That's the way you do it. We also simulcast, by the way, over here on my Facebook page as well as on my YouTube live stream. Thank you all for being here today on Jimmy Rants. If you missed the live, you can watch it on replay on IGTV. You can also watch the replay over on YouTube. Just type in a keyword, Jimmy Rants. You will find the show. And finally, go to jimmyrants.com. It's the official website for this here show. You can see all the past episodes there. And if you got value out of this here today, or out of any of the Jimmy Rants that I've done, please give value back to me. Click on that Patreon link right there at jimmyrants.com, and it certainly helps us keep this show on the air. So that's it for now, you guys. We'll be back again real soon with another episode of Jimmy Rants. Bye. All right.